Now that you've categorized the information types and your information system, you've made it to the select step. This first task in the select step, we're going to select the control baseline that you'll use to start building the controls that'll be required for your information system. First task, control selection. Let's jump into it. This is task S1, control selection. Welcome to the select step. Select the controls for the system and the environment of operation is the task we're going to conduct in S1. Potential inputs include security categorization, organization and system level risk assessment results, system element information, system component inventory, a list of security and privacy requirements allocated to the system elements, and the environment of operation, a list of contractual requirements allocated to external providers of the system or system element, business impact analysis or criticality analysis, risk management strategy, organizational security and privacy policy, federal or organization approved or mandated baselines or overlays, and finally, cybersecurity framework profiles. Outputs for this task include controls selected for the system and the environment of operation. So the big point of this task is to define the controls we're going to start with to build the controls that are going to eventually be required for the system. So in this task, we build the baseline control based on how the organization defines this requirement. Primary responsibility is the system owner or the common control provider. Supporting roles for this task include the authorizing official, the authorizing official's designated representative, the information owner or information steward, the system security engineer, the privacy engineer, and the system security officer. It does align with the SDLC. For a new system, it aligns with development and acquisition, and for an existing system, it aligns with operations and maintenance. It does align to profile in the cybersecurity framework. There are two approaches that can be used for the initial selection of controls: the baseline control selection approach and the organizationally generated control selection approach. And we'll look at both of those in this lesson. The baseline control selection approach uses control baselines, which are predefined sets of controls specifically assembled to address the protection needs of a group, organization, or a community of interest. Control baselines serve as the starting point for the protection of individuals' privacy, information, and information systems. So remember, these baselines are the starting point. They're not the controls you're going to end up with when we go into the implementation stage, because we're going to tailor them as a task in this step. But we need a starting point. We need a starting point to start with so that we can have a set of controls that we can tailor. So that's what we're going to do with this. We're going to get that baseline to start with. Federal control baselines are provided in Special Publication 853B or 853 Bravo. The system security categorization that we took care of in task C2 and the security requirements derived from stakeholder protection needs, laws, executive orders, regulation policies, directives, instructions, and standards from way back in task P15 can help inform the selection of security control baselines. So when we look at NIST Special Publication 853 Bravo, it's going to define 3 levels of baselines: low, moderate, and high. And these are a good way to start if we're going to think about a federal system that's not an NSS or a national security system, not part of the intelligence community or the DoD NSS system. Then we can use either low, moderate, or high. We can pick one of these baselines from 853 Bravo, and it gives us a set of controls to start with. And that's easy enough. If we fall in the category that can use that, then we just pick one of the control baselines and we finish this task. We have our control baseline. Privacy programs use security and privacy control baselines to manage privacy risks arising from both unauthorized system activity or behavior as well as from authorized activity. So we want to control both unauthorized and authorized activities around our privacy. Privacy protection is important, and it's growing in its importance over time. After we determine a control baseline, organizations tailor the baseline in accordance with the guidance provided. And that's going to be in the next task we do, task S2, which is tailoring of this baseline. So once we figure out the initial baseline to start with, we know that these aren't the controls we're going to end up with when we go into the implementation step, but this is the starting point. And then in the next task, we're going to tailor this control baseline so it actually fits the system we're building. The baseline control selection approach can provide consistency across a broad community of interest. So if we have these baselines set up for a community that's large, it's easy to set these in place and know that everyone in that community of interest is starting from the same starting point. Organizationally generated control selection approach differs from the baseline selection approach because the organization does not start with a predefined set of control. Rather, the organization uses its own selection process to select controls. In this case, we're kind of starting from, in some cases, a totally blank sheet of paper, and we're selecting controls from the control catalog that fit the purpose of our system. So this may be necessary when the system is highly specialized, like a weapon system or a medical device, or it has a limited purpose or scope, something like a smart meter. So in these cases, we want to pick out of the control catalog those specific controls that make sense for the system. This reduces the amount of time we have to tailor the system, of course. In these situations, it may be more efficient and cost-effective for an organization to select a specific set of controls for the system, the bottom-up approach, instead of starting with a predefined set of controls from a broad-based control baseline and subsequently eliminating controls through the tailoring process, which is kind of that top-down approach. So we want to start with this one. We start with a limited set and then we add controls in. So there is a sense of tailoring, but essentially we're doing that in S1. We're building the system with the controls specifically set for that system. So when we hit task S2, it's going to be much smaller because we already have a very specific set of controls. Whereas a baseline, we start with especially a federal baseline, say the moderate level baseline, there may be a lot of controls that we have to eliminate or tailor in the next task. In both the baseline control selection approach and the organizationally generated control selection approach, organizations develop a well-defined set of security and privacy requirements using a life cycle based systems engineering process. For example, ISO 15288 and special publication 800-160 Volume 1, which is actually derived from ISO 15288. As described in the RMF Prepare System Level Task, which is task P15, if you remember way back to that task. So we want to have a life cycle based systems engineering process. So either way we go forward, if we're using the baseline selection approach or the organizationally generated control selection approach, we're going to use this life cycle based systems engineering process. We're going to think about controls over the entire life cycle of the system and how those are modified, changed, and managed over the time of the system's life. This process generates a set of requirements that can be used to guide and inform the selection of a set of controls to satisfy the requirements, whether the organization starts with a control baseline or generates a set of controls from its own selection process. This means we're just going to look at the requirements. What are the protection requirements and the regulatory requirements of the system we're building, and do we have controls that match that? Similarly, organizations can use the NIST cybersecurity framework to develop a cybersecurity profile representing a set of organizationally specific security and privacy requirements, and thus guiding the informing control selection from NIST Special Publication 853. Tailoring may also be required in the organizationally generated control selection approach, and that's going to be the next task. So whether we start with a baseline that's defined for us, or if we use the organizationally generated control selection, the next task we have to go through, right? For both ways of building our control set, we still want to tailor it to make sure that even if it's organizationally generated for that specific system, we do want to go through the tailoring process to make sure that the controls accurately represent the requirements for that system. Organizations do not need to choose one approach for the selection of a control for each of their systems, but instead may use different approaches as circumstances dictate. So when we're setting up our RMF program for our organization, we don't have to say all of our systems are going to use baselines or all of our systems are going to use organizationally generated control selection. We can use both of these methods depending on what we need for the system. References for this task include FIPS 199 and 200 and special publications 830, 53, 53 Bravo, 160 Volume 1, 161, and IR 8062 and 8179, as well as CN SSI 1253 and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. In this module, we talked about a lot of things about building a baseline and getting a set of controls that we're going to start with to continue through the selection process. We talked about the task S1, we talked about inputs and outputs, roles and responsibilities, the SDLC and cybersecurity framework alignment. We talked about the selection approach, the baseline approach, federal control baselines, privacy programs, tailoring, communities of interest, organizationally generated control selection, security and privacy requirements, requirement generation, the cybersecurity framework, the selection approach, and references. If any of this doesn't make sense to you, if any of it doesn't look right, go back and watch the video again. If it does, then we'll go on to the lesson, take care of some of the tasks within the courseware material. If you're not following along with the course at Cyber-Recon, go on to the next video, and we will see you either in the lesson or in the next course.